Hey everybody, welcome to week 6 of our English 3085 online course. This week, we're back in the swing of things with our threshold concepts study. We are going to be reading the next 2 sections of Naming What We Know, and you guys will be conducting your second threshold concept case study this week. Now, this week is Mental Health Week, which at Wayne State University is something that we've recently started observing just to officially support everyone in checking in and taking care of yourselves. What I'm doing in honor of Mental Health Week is I've actually gone ahead and changed the due date for your threshold concept case study to give everybody an across-the-board 2-day extension. So instead of being due Sunday night at midnight, your threshold concept case studies and the peer review that goes with them will be due Tuesday, February 23rd. I hope the extra time gives you a little more wiggle room to check in with yourself or to connect with someone that you trust or care about, or even just to take some time to rest this week. All right, so I'm going to switch over to our Canvas view and talk you guys through our assignments this week. And then at the end of the video, I'll close out with our mini lecture covering the threshold concepts for this week. Okay, so here we are, week 6. You guys will see that both of the sections from Naming What We Know are posted here as PDFs. The threshold concept case study number 2 is the same assignment that you guys looked at before. This time, I'd just like you to choose a new genre to work with. So whatever genre you chose for threshold concept 1, whatever concept you chose to work with, this time we're choosing a concept that's within these 2 readings. And please choose a new genre to look at as your evidence for whichever concept that you're going to talk about. Now, when we look at our week 6 schedule, it's fairly straightforward. You want to watch the week 6 instructor video, which you're already doing, so high five. Read these 2 sections from Naming What We Know, and hopefully by now you guys are seeing that the readings are not super arduous. They're not supposed to be theoretically or technically difficult, although there are quite a few concepts embedded in each mini subsection in the form of all those citations. If you guys have been noticing that each section really draws on a swath of literature within the field of rhetoric and composition, you can feel free to chase down those leads if anything becomes really interesting to you, or bookmark them in your brain for later on in the semester. After spring break, we're going to move on to a more current research project, and you might want to have those citations handy if any of these concepts become relevant to you for that. And then the thing that you're going to write this week is your threshold concept case study number 2. So I'm going to switch over to our PowerPoint so that I can talk you through a really quick mini lesson. I'm just going to hit the high points for these 2 readings, and then we'll close out this video. Okay. So the readings that we're looking at this week are touching on concepts that you will hopefully be familiar with from last week's look at the social turn within rhetoric and composition literature. We are looking at writing as a social and rhetorical activity and writing as a cognitive activity. So a lot of the concepts that are being dealt with in these readings are fleshing out our look at the historical turn from cognitivism to social construction that we looked at last week. So first, let's talk really quickly about writing as a social and rhetorical activity. So writing is always socially situated, and this is something that decades of research bears out. That's not really within question. I think the question has always been, to what extent is writing socially situated? And part of that gets sort of drawn out in some of these subsections. So particularly when we talk about being socially situated, we mean rhetorically situated, in that writing is always written for some purpose to some audience. And this, of course, if you've taken English 1020 with me or with others, you might recognize the shape of the triangle as our sort of symbol for the rhetorical situation, which has the rhetor, the purpose or message, and the audience kind of in a dynamic relationship. Now, additionally, we have to understand that even as we acknowledge these rhetorical situations in anything we write, that even that dynamic triad becomes complicated by modality, by technology, and by interpretation. So we have to acknowledge that not only is writing a socially situated rhetorical activity, but that activity in and of itself becomes further complicated by things like technology. Technology, of course, could be something like a pen. A pen and paper is considered technology. Digital technologies, of course, are things that we work with all the time. Either way, it's performing what we call remediation. And I don't mean like remedial, like going back to basics. Remediation or mediation is when communication is translated through some kind of apparatus, be it the apparatus of the human brain, as in my cognition is being remediated by my speech. So that's sort of an embodied utterance. Or if it's being remediated through pen to paper, which adds another layer of complexity and translation. As we all know, when you think a thought, or if you think about several thoughts, and then you try to put them down on paper, what words are actually articulated are often different than the thoughts themselves, right? Maybe we write something down and we feel frustrated because it's not quite exactly how we were thinking it in our minds. That's a process of remediation. That also happens if we're going to take something that's a thought or even something alphabetic text-based, and then we remediate it further into something digital, visual, or a combo into a multimedia genre. So basically, what I'm doing right now in taking our readings, the Threshold Concept chapters, I'm translating them into visual and audio modes. And so that's changing the meaning slightly. It's putting my own voice into the conversation, and it's adding new layers of meaning. And so that's something else that further complicates this rhetorical situation, is that in the process of remediating consciousness, we are making new meaning, which is wild and a little mind-blowing. But writing is a process that both creates meaning and is shaped by the modes and modalities that we're using to create the communication. And further, writing itself becomes shaped by both my purposes as a rhetor, the audience to whom I'm tailoring my information, and then any feedback that I might get about my writing, assessment, as it were, shapes my writing further. So even if I'm writing for an intended audience of, say, a conference that I'm trying to send a proposal to, I might first draft a proposal and send it to my friend who's also a scholar within rhetoric and composition. And she might send me some feedback, which then might change how the writing looks, because I might do some revisions based on her feedback. So both there's action and purpose happening in that writing creates meaning, addressing certain rhetorical situations, and then it's shaped by assessment, so meaning coming in. So now our nice, neat little triangle has just been all effed up, right? Like we just now have added several new dimensions to this social rhetorical activity because it's not just moving in a linear two-plane, two-dimensional triangle, but it's being acted upon by multiple different dimensions, further complicating it. So if that wasn't enough to kind of blow your mind, speaking of the mind, writing is also always a cognitive activity. So not only are there lots of complicated movements and dimensions from audience, social constructs, assessment, the making of meaning, but also writing happens in our minds, right? We're composing. Part of it is, we call it brainstorming. It happens in our minds, or as one of our authors writes, in the skull. What's happening inside of the skull? So that's the trick of it. And also the two are always also happening at the same time. We maybe have fallen into a ditch one way or the other within rhet comp theory, writing so staunchly for social construction or so staunchly for cognition that some scholars have said, whoa, wait a minute, we have to acknowledge how the two work together. But so for cognition happens, like we said, in a skull, which is part of a body. And that's when we talk about embodied cognition. Writing is what happens when a brain that's attached to a body sends some signals of communication, and that those communications are acted out by the body. So cognition isn't something like, we can't just put a brain in a vat and then say that that's a writer. A writer is a human who has a body that's connected to their brain, and that helps the brain perform these activities. It's getting intense here, and I'm going to try to keep it more focused. The nature of cognition is important and discrete from metacognition. So the way I like to think about it is by using etymological markers here. So cognition, I think of, the processes of my brain, my neurons firing, the content that I may or may not be thinking about, or maybe even the process of my thinking, which part of the brain are these signals running through, etc. Metacognition, I think of the prefix meta as being, something that's above and surrounding and outside of. And so I think that metacognition is the thinking that happens above and around and outside of my cognition. So this is where we get the trite little phrase, thinking about thinking. But what is really important is that as we have studied writing as a cognitive process, we see both pros and cons to this cognition. First of all, if you think too much in the same vein, you fall into what's called habituation, or it's kind of talked about in our readings like a rut. Excuse me, dry throat here. That can be countered, our readings argue, by reflection and metacognition. So if you're just mindlessly doing the same writing processes and not thinking about why, that can lead you into a writing rut, and that can actually have adverse consequences when you start putting your writing out to real audiences. Reflection and metacognition can help you, pause and re-examine why you might be taking yourself through the cognitive processes for writing that you are. And it can help you do things like pause and ask yourself, hey, should I keep writing in the same way? Or should I try something else? If you should keep writing in that same way, you keep going. But it's that pause to do that tiny bit of reflection Do I need to use a different approach? Does this rhetorical situation call for a different writing process or a different tone or a different fill in the blank aspect of writing performance? Does that make sense? Okay. So that was a lot crammed into 2 slides. Many, many decades of research represented here. But if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about in this quick mini lecture, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. Also, make sure that you make good use of Rachel, your peer mentor. She is here to support you. And both of us are just so proud of everything you guys are doing. Keep up the good work and have a good mental health week. Bye, everybody.